This video is going to be a crash course on starting automating with VBA in Excel. But before writing any code, you need to understand how Excel is structured behind the scenes. And because VBA is just code that talks to Excel's object model. So here's the hierarchy that you'll be working with in Excel, VBA 99% of the time. The first is the application. That's the actual Excel instance, the excel.exe that's running on your computer. And then each application is a collection of workbooks. So that's what you can cycle through the workbooks that are open. That's the actual files that are open. And then the files contain worksheets. Those are going to be your tabs. And there's also charts and things like that. But worksheet is the main hierarchy. And a worksheet is made up of ranges, a collection of ranges. And then the range is made up of a collection of cells. And so that's the hierarchy that you'll be dealing with going from top to bottom. And so it's just application is a collection of all the different things, and each one has its own child. So let's take a look at these objects. And the first one is within the application is the workbooks. So in Excel VBA provides you three different ways to interact with those. There's this workbook, active workbook, and then the workbooks collection. Now let's take a look at these. So I've created a little example here. And so I have book one, book two, and book three. So three workbooks open. And then in my VBA editor, I have book one, book two, and book three. And I've inserted a little module here just with a test macro that'll just print out the workbook name. And so the first thing I'm going to do is just run this under book one to show you that it comes out with workbook name is book one, because this workbook is always going to be where the macro resides. So this macro is under book one. So no matter which workbook I have activated, so if I have activated number two, if I print this again, it's still going to be book one, because this workbook is always going to reference the workbook that the macro is inside of. So now I can change this to active workbook. And what that will do is it'll actually give me the workbook name of whichever workbook is the current active one. So like I've selected workbook 2, and I'm going to clear this out. If I run this macro, it'll actually show workbook 2. I come over here, change that, run the macro again, workbook 3. So that's the difference. Active workbook is whichever workbook you have currently showing and selected as the active one, as opposed to this workbook where you always reference the one where the macro is in. And that's useful for when you're actually writing macros that'll work with other workbooks. So say you write a macro that actually goes and gets data from another workbook, you always want to use this workbook.activate to get back to your workbook that has the macro in it. And then the last one is actually workbooks. And then if you open up a parentheses, you'll notice it has an index. And so this takes either a number, and I could say workbooks 1, which will just be the index of the workbook, which will be, this one will be book 1. So it'll be the first one in the sequence. And this also takes a string where you can actually put in the workbook name. And so if I want to select workbook 2, I can actually reference it by the name as well. And so when I selected that, it knows I'm in workbook 2. And so the index is a 1 based index, not a 0 based index. So if you know it's the first one, you do 1, but otherwise you can reference it by name, or you could do the active one, which is the currently active one, or this workbook is where the macro is. And now one last thing to remark about workbooks is and when you're working between them, you want to use the activate function in order to activate a workbook. And so to show you this, this for loop goes quickly through all your open workbooks. The application.workbooks is the collection, and I can actually cycle through them for each workbook. And what I'm going to do is activate it and then wait 10 seconds. And now I'm going to put it on book 3 just to show you. So when I click play on that, it's going to activate 1, wait 2 seconds, activate 2, wait 2 seconds, and then activate 3. So when you want to actually get data from it, you activate the workbook, and then you can manipulate the data on that workbook, and then you want to activate the workbook that you're going to paste the data to. So the next object in the hierarchy is going to be the sheets. And those are the tabs within Excel. And you can access those through 3 different methods. You have active sheet, sheets, and worksheets. Now let's look into those. And so for this example, I've created in this workbook, I've created 3 sheets. I've called it first sheet, second sheet, and third sheet. But then and I've also created a chart sheet. Now, when you just go to insert and do a chart, it's going to actually embed it, and that is not a chart sheet. But if you actually right click a chart and say move to a new sheet, then it creates something that's completely different called a chart sheet. And so that will actually show up with a different icon in the Visual Basic Explorer. And now I'll show you how that differs in the actual VBA side of things. So I've created this little for loop here, and it's going to declare a worksheet, and then it's going to go through all the worksheets in the actual application or in this workbook. So I'm going to run it. And so I see that my worksheet name is first sheet and code name is sheet 1, and it goes through the 3. But you'll notice chart sheet is missing. And that's because I used worksheets. So worksheets is only going to give you the tabs that actually have cells on them. A chart sheet is just going to be a chart. And so that's what is ignored there. And so if I wanted to actually see all of the tabs that I have in there, it's just plain sheets. And I'm going to actually have to change my variable here as well, just because, or type because it'll actually error out if it thinks it's a worksheet. And so now I run this again, and now you'll see chart sheet actually shows up here. And so that's the difference. Worksheets is only going to be tabs with cells, and then sheets is going to be anything. It could be a chart sheet, could be a worksheet. Those are your most common. I think there's some more, but those are pretty much what you'll be dealing with. So now I want to take focus on the code name versus the name. And so you'll see that in what I've shown down here is like the name does not necessarily match. And so the name is actually what's in parentheses. That is what a user will be able to see on the actual tab. Now the code name is actually what Excel is storing it as, and this one's like sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3. And that could be very beneficial to you because you can actually reference that, and if you hit like sheet 1 and then put a period, the IntelliSense will show up. It does not work like that for the actual worksheet name. So if I did worksheets and then even choose first sheet and then hit a dot, it's not going to give me any IntelliSense because it's just referencing it by the name. It may not work. And so that's the difference. If you want to do things based on the code, it's always best to use the code name. But there is a little caveat to that. If somebody deletes that sheet, that code name is gone and you will get debug errors. And just like workbooks had activate in order to get to them and show it to the user, worksheets don't have activate, they have select. And so what that'll do is actually select the worksheet. Now, if you're cycling through workbooks, you need to make sure the workbook is activated first. Otherwise, you'll get an error. But in order to go to specific sheets, you just select them. And so, in this example, I'm going to go for each worksheet in this workbook. I'm going to select it, wait 2 seconds, and then print a little message. So, like I'm on the first sheet, and if I click play here, you'll see that it'll actually select the second sheet now, and wait 2 seconds, select the third sheet. And because I used worksheets, it didn't touch that chart sheet. Now, if I had changed this to an object and changed this to sheets, it would actually go through all 4 of them. And so to reference by index, you can actually put in the number. And so if I say sheets 1, when I run this, I can say sheet 1, and it'll always be first sheet. So I could be on any sheet and it'll be indexed. And that is a index of where it's located. So if I actually move this sheet to the first and then come over here and run this macro again, now it's so second sheet is here because this index is based on where they are in the sequence over here. And so if you want to manipulate them, that will change the index. So if you start creating macros that are based on the index, as soon as a user moves a sheet, that could throw off your macro altogether. So the best option is either to cycle through all the sheets and find the sheet name that you're looking for, or use code names um, because the user can't change code names, or actually reference the name itself. And because you can do that as well. So if I say first sheet, just like with workbooks, I can reference that name. And so when I do that, and let's clear that out of there. and do it again. And so I run first sheet, and then it doesn't matter which index they are, which one I'm selected on. It'll always be first sheet because I'm referencing it by its name. And just like with workbooks having active workbook, worksheets have active sheet. And what that is the one that you have currently selected. And so over here in this example, I'm declaring a variable, and so I can set it to active sheet, and then I can print the work name. So I have first sheet selected. If I run this macro, first sheet is the one that it shows here. If I select second sheet, come over here, run it again. Now I see second sheet. And same thing for third sheet. Print that again, third sheet. And so the active sheet will be the current one that you have selected. So if you want to manipulate the one that you're looking at, always use active sheet. But if you know it's a different sheet, then you reference the actual sheet itself. And now one last thing I would mention about worksheets is that worksheets do have a lot of different properties to them. And if you have an object as declared with declaring your variables. So I can say ws dot, and then you can actually scroll through all the different properties that they have. And like one of the most useful ones, probably columns. And so if you're looking for specific columns in a sheet, you can reference the columns there. And it also has rows. So if you know it's a specific set of rows, you can actually reference rows. But you do have access to a lot of different functions. And I highly recommend using the IntelliSense. And so declaring your variables gives you that IntelliSense, and then you can actually reference specific things within that worksheet. So the next object in the hierarchy is range. And so that's going to be the grouping of cells that you have on your individual tabs within Excel. Now let's take a look at those. So when you're looking at ranges, a range is the actual cells within your worksheet, but it can be a single cell or it can be a grouping of cells. And so for this one, and it's always based on the address. And so this one is A1, this is cell A1, it's what shows up here. So if I run this real quick, it's going to pull date. And if I change that to A2, pulling the value from it is going to pull what's in A2. Change that to A3, run it again, and then it'll pull what's in value A3. And so if I actually wanted to change some data, I can actually set the value of the range. And I'll just do that here. Range dot value equals new data. Now I run that again. It'll actually put that value here. And now, so and the value function is only going to work for single cell ranges. So like A4 is a single cell. Now for this one, say I do a named range, and so this one is 6 cells and I named it example. If I pull example here, when I run this, I'm going to get an error. And the reason for that is because the range, when you're messing with the value, it can only be a single cell. And but I do actually have the information from that address or from that range. And just to show you how that works, if I click that, and now it actually knows that it's E3 to G4, but I just can't change the value. So I am getting that range. I'm just not being able to access the value from it unless I go through the individual cells. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And now, just as workbooks have active workbook, worksheets have active sheet, range has an option as well, and it's called selection. So it is a little different, so it's not exactly as intuitive. But when I choose selection, it's gonna give me whatever I'm selected on. So if I clear this out here, and then if I say I run this, it'll say date. And if I change the cursor to a different cell, I run this again, now it's going to pull that. And same here, run it again. And so the selection is actually going to be your active selected range. And this will allow you to, you can select and get the address from a selection as well. And you can manipulate data based on what the user currently has selected. And now the last object in the hierarchy is the cells. That's the individual cells that contain data within Excel. And now let's take a look at those. So going back to my example earlier, so I have this set here that's just 6 cells. It's named example. if I have my range variable and I set the range to example, I can get the value based on the cells, and those are index based. And it's a one, it's not zero based, it starts at one, and that's going to be the row and the column. And so that's how I can index which value I'm looking for. And so if I run that, I see that's in one. So if I want what's in row one, column two, I just say that. If I want row two, column three, I say that. And so that'll pull of that particular range. And if you don't want to give it both the row and the column, if you just give it one number, it's going to start in the top left, go right until it's out of the range. And so like for this one, it's E to G, the range is E to G. It'll actually stop at G and then go back on the next row. So if I run this, now it knows example, because example is in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th cell. And so you can reference it by row and column, or just the number in cell, starting top going to the right, top left going to right, and then down through that. So that's how you can access the individual values within a range. And cells exists on worksheets as well. So if I just change that to worksheet and then set my worksheet to the active sheet, because active sheet, all it is just a set of cells. And so I can index those as well. And so if I say 6, it's probably going to be blank, because 6 is going to be right here for as far as that goes. But if I wanted row 1, column 1, and ran that, and let's clear that out, row 1, column 1, it knows that's date, because worksheet is just a range. It's just a special type of range. And so I can index the values within that as well. So that's the rundown of it. So you start at the application, and then it just works you all the way down to the cells to where you get that data. And with VBA, you have all sorts of different ways to manipulate that data to get it exactly how you want it. So now the last thing to discuss is the VBA project hierarchy. So the application workbooks and everything, that's what the user interacts with. The VBA project hierarchy works in parallel to that. And so the first thing you have is a workbook with a VBA project. Every workbook has a VBA project, whether you're doing macros or not. It actually creates one by default, and it's a one-to-one. And you can't have two VBA projects in a workbook. It's just one VBA project. And the VBA project is made up of three things. They're made up of Excel objects. That's going to be your worksheets and your chart sheets and things like that. User forms, which are you can actually create actual little visual forms for users to input information into. You don't necessarily have to work with the data on the worksheet. You can actually create user forms, which will work as like an input sheet. And then the modules. That is where your macros will live. Now let's take a look. So in the Visual Basic Editor, what you'll have is the VBA project, which is the top level object here. And that's based on the workbook. Like I said, it's a one-to-one relationship. So there's only one per workbook. And then it'll have different folders where you have your different items. So you'll have your macros that are all going to be under modules. User forms are going to be under a forms folder. And then your Excel objects, which are your sheets. And it also, this is where this workbook lives. So you can actually set different macros specific to this workbook, especially in its events. And so if you want to actually set some things of when the workbook opens, you can actually set different events based on what happens. You can create macros here. So, and macros can exist in all of these, but these are the macros that are here are just the standalone macros, and every other macro is based on something of this object, like macros for the form, macros for the sheet, such as, for this workbook, that's where it could be open, sheet. If you made a change in the selection, if you double clicked, you can actually handle double clicks on a cell and things like that. I hope you found this video useful. Once you understand the hierarchy and you can work your way from the top to the bottom of the hierarchy and be able to manipulate data the exact way that you want it to, it can change your world in using Excel, and you can do multiple things. So please like and subscribe, and I'll continue posting videos showing you how to use VBA within all the Office applications.